All right, welcome everybody. We are here at the beginning October episode of the Freedom Hub Working Groups. I really appreciate you being here today. As you'll notice, we've got up our main screen here. We've got a link to register to be on these ongoing. So if you're looking to give the link out to others, this is it, and it's in caps on purpose. So it is case sensitive. And then we do have our channel on Brighteon, and I'm going to scoot over there for a minute so you can see what that looks like. And this is where we've got all of the videos that we've been recording, and every week we publish the new ones on here. So there's some fantastic videos. I assure you there's not a bad one in the bunch. And we were just discussing the idea of passion, and the people on the bulk of those are pretty darn passionate, as you'll see. So it is pretty exciting. And then also we're being sponsored by freedomhub.com, and this is where we're going to find out a lot of stuff about for your health, freedom, and other things that are helping disrupt the entrepreneurial world out there. And before we kind of get into today's guests, we're going to do a little fill in here on what's about to happen. So why don't you, Charles, do me the honors of giving a little rundown on our future events?
Sure, Jeff. Thanks. Charlie Froman here. I work with Jeff on our disrupting of the health markets. And as libertarians, we reserve the right to maintain this weekly webinar to really tie it all together, because all the liberty issues are the same, really. And over the next month, we always preview our weekly guests. Todd Meyer from the Washington Policy Center will talk about free market environmentalism. Climate change is always pushed on us from the mainstream, so we thought we would shed some truth on how you actually can clean up the flora and fauna. In a couple weeks, we will have Jim Lee from Climate Viewer to push the envelope on acceptable discussions, as we tend to do on this weekly event. Ronald Bailey, the science writer at Reason, proposed seeding the clouds to save our planet. Jim Lee might have a bit more to say about that than what you could read in Reason magazine. So everyone is suspicious about the skies, so join us for that one and you'll have some fun, if nothing else. In 3 weeks, a refugee from Russia, Gorbachev's econ advisor, Yuri Maltsev, now with a variety of groups, including the Mises Institute, will talk about the state of desocializing the world. Finally, a month from now, Richard Ebeling with the Future of Freedom Foundation and other organizations as well will talk about that great issue that Ron Paul galvanized almost a decade ago, End the Fed. So that's our preview, Jeff.
Fantastic. That's going to be another exciting one for sure. This is a little quick filler here before we jump over to the guest again. We do have our LinkedIn page, so you're certainly welcome to participate in that and be a part of it. We'll do some nice notices and some great commentary and stuff takes place there, so please register if you wish. Again, here's Your Freedom Hub. So again, we're going to be able to talk a lot of stuff about some different products and services and so on that really fit your needs in that regard. And then today we are going to be having something pretty interesting, to be sure. So why don't you do a little intro here, and then we're going to turn this over to today's celebrity.
Sure, Jeff. David Theroux, back in the 70s, helped found the eminent libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, as their VP of Academic Affairs. And since then, he has founded a couple of different organizations. Over the past few decades, he's been known as the Independent Institute founder and president. They have a lot of top-notch scholars. We'll be hearing from his foreign affairs expert, Ivan Eland, come January, I think, or February. And he's written a lot of books, and he's gotten a lot of awards for those books. And Jeff, if I can see that intro page again, what I want to read from that is, what of his work that spurred this event, and that was his book, Everything Voluntary, From Politics to Parenting. 3 things. The second thing, a presentation he gave on why C.S. Lewis is as influential as ever. And finally, an article he wrote on reversing the flight from the family. And when you tie those things together in preparing for this event, he founded another group called the C.S. Lewis Society in California. And he talks a lot about C.S. Lewis, the famous writer, and his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, and how both were political, not just talented in the writing department, and were very suspicious of statism, using government to get your way. And if he ties those authors to sort of the plight the family is under, he's not going to recommend a bunch of government programs and support for families or individuals, but rather freedom, voluntaryism. So that, in a broad brushstroke, is kind of what David Theroux will discuss today. He'll have more specifically on what he wants to say when he starts speaking. He has an MBA from Chicago and several degrees from Berkeley, and that is today's guest. Jeff?
Sounds pretty good to me. David, I think you should now have that host prompt in your hands. And if you want to just share the screen, we are ready to be regaled.
Okay.
I hear you fine. There we go. Perfect.
Great. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to join with you and the audience that's tuned in. My talk or discussion today is on C.S. Lewis on Mere Liberty and the Evils of Statism. For decades, many Christians and non-Christians, both conservative and liberal, have unfortunately embraced an ill-conceived, quote-unquote, progressive, i.e. authoritarian vision to wield intrusive government powers. And this has been really viewed as sort of an unquestionable, even sanctified calling for both domestic and international matters. And in doing so, they've essentially abandoned the Judeo-Christian natural law tradition in moral ethics and economics. In contrast, the Oxford-Cambridge scholar and best-selling author C.S. Lewis did not suffer such delusions, despite the gigantic and deeply disturbing advances in conflicts of total war, the total state, and genocides that developed during his lifetime. Lewis's aversion to government was clearly revealed in 1951 when Winston Churchill, within weeks after he regained office as Prime Minister of Great Britain, wrote to Lewis offering to have him knighted as Commander of the Order of the British Empire. However, Lewis flatly declined the honor because he, unlike progressives, was never really interested in politics and was deeply skeptical of government power and politicians. He expressed this in the first two lines of his poem, Lines During a General Election, in which he says, "Their threats are terrible enough, but we could hear all that. It is their promises that bring despair." Lewis held this view for many years. In 1940, he wrote a letter to his brother Warren, in which he says, quote, "Could one start a stagnation party, which in general elections would boast that during his term in office, no event of the least importance had taken place." He further stated, "I was by nature against government." Now, Robert Higgs, who's been an active senior fellow here for many years, just recently retired, he is well known for having refuted this progressive narrative or myth in American history in his pioneering book from the Independent Institute called Crisis and Leviathan. Nevertheless, given the zeitgeist progressive bias, was C.S. Lewis just ignorant or naive about modern realities, or was he aiming at a deeper and more significant purpose? Lewis was unquestionably and profoundly interested in the ideas and institutions that were the basis for free and virtuous individuals and communities, but he was not at all interested in partisanship or campaign politics. He instead focused on first principles, and public policy matters were of interest only as they pertained to questions of enduring value. As a result of this focus, whereas he focused on first principles, the work of most other scholars and writers quickly becomes dated and obsolete. Lewis's work has achieved increasing timeliness and relevance. His books continue to sell at an astounding rate. And although he's best known for his fiction, he also wrote superb books in philosophy and theology, literary criticism and history, poetry, autobiography, and at last count, more than 50,000 letters to individuals worldwide. His best friend was J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Lewis and Tolkien created a literary society in Oxford called the Inklings, which met twice a week in Lewis's apartment at Magdalen College at Oxford and in various pubs in Oxford. And they would read each other's manuscripts over beer and tell jokes and have a great time. But that's where Lewis and Tolkien's work and the work of other members of the Inklings came from. Throughout his work, Lewis infused an interconnected worldview that championed objective truth, moral ethics, natural law, literary excellence, reason, science, individual liberty, personal responsibility and virtue, and Christian theism. In so doing, he critiqued naturalism, reductionism, nihilism, positivism, scientism, historicism, collectivism, atheism, statism of all forms, coercive egalitarianism, militarism, welfarism, and dehumanization and tyranny. But unlike progressive crusaders for predatory government power over the peaceful pursuits of people, Lewis noted that, quote, "I do not like the pretensions of government, the grounds on which it demands my obedience, to be pitched too high. I don't like the medicine man's magical pretensions, nor the Bourbon's divine right. This is not solely because I disbelieve in magic and in Bossuet's politique. I believe in God, but I detest theocracy. For every government consists of mere men and is strictly viewed a makeshift. If it adds to its commands, 'Thus saith the Lord,' it lies, and it lies dangerously," unquote. Lewis addressed not only the evils of totalitarianism as manifested in fascism and communism, but the more subtle forms that face us on a daily basis, including the administrative, welfare, therapeutic, nanny, and scientific states. Of all tyrannies, he stated, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, as they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They be more likely to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's own will and cured of states which maybe not regard as disease is to put us on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals," unquote. Throughout his books, Lewis defended the rights and sanctity of individuals against tyranny, not just because he opposed evil, but because he considered a life in freedom, including both social and economic freedom, to be essential. Here's Lewis again. "I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he had the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by government. And in adult life, it is the man who needs and asks nothing of government who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology." As the sociologist Rodney Stark discusses in his book, The Victory of Reason, Cicero and others had contemplated this concept of the self or individualism and free will before the Christian era. But it was not until Jesus personally asserted in words and deeds the concept of universal moral equality before an individual responsibility to God, and not until Christian theologians made it a central feature of their doctrine, that the rights of each and every individual were championed and slavery was condemned and subsequently abolished. This bold advance in thinking arose in part from the revolutionary insight of methodological individualism in the study of human behavior, wherein the individual is considered primary. The Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises further stated that, quote, "The collective has no existence and reality in the actions of individuals, but in the actions of individuals. It comes into existence by ideas that move individuals to behave as members of a definite group and goes out of existence when the persuasive power of these ideas subside." And Stark had pointed out that although almost every other culture and religion in ancient history viewed human society in terms of the tribe, the polis, or the collective, quote, "It is the individual who is the focus of Christian political thought, and this in turn explicitly shaped the views of later European political philosophers," unquote. This focus produced a radical change in a world where, despite notable but limited exceptions of political decentralization, slavery and nearly universal and unyielding despotism had ruled, where people were treated as mere members of a group without rights. With Christianity, each and every person is, quote, "a child of God," unquote, or a holy object who has free will and is individually responsible for the choices he or she makes. In this tradition, Thomas Aquinas stated, "A man can direct and govern his own actions also. Therefore, the rational creature participates in the divine providence, not only in being governed, but also in governing." Working from this Christian background, Lewis stressed the importance of the natural law of moral ethics, a code of moral conscience that is inescapable and defines each person as human. Such morality exists on its own, independent of subjective choices or experiences, just as one might grasp the inherent truism of mathematics or natural physical laws such as gravity. Lewis drew on the insights of such thinkers as the Apostle Paul, Augustine, Magnus, Aquinas, Cicero, Grotius, Blackstone, Acton, and Locke, and he considered modernist dismissals of such work to be fundamentally erroneous. In particular, both Aquinas' notion of, quote, "common sense," unquote, as described in his Summa Theologica, and the legacy of rational theism found in Jewish, Islamic, Christian, and certain pagan writers, the core philosophical system of the West, had a powerful effect on Lewis. To him, the culture of modernism, so-called, is not just an historical aberration of this quote-unquote common sense, but a profound threat to the pursuit of truth, goodness, and civilization itself. This common sense, or Lewis's notion of common rationality, consisted in part of each individual human being's intrinsic understanding of an objective, universal, and natural legal order of truth and morality, the natural law, or what Lewis called the Tao, upon which each person discerns, chooses, and acts. Incidentally, by the Tao, Lewis means the way or the truth, not Taoism. For Lewis, each individual responds to and can come to know and experience this external reality of truth. It is, quote unquote, a common knowledge. This insight is similar to Adam Smith's view, as expressed in his 1759 book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that individuals are born with an innate moral conscience and sympathy for the well-being of others, and can maintain them by following the natural law. Lewis argued that a natural moral law is known to all, and this natural moral code is inescapable as human beings. It is the basis of all moral judgment. Its foundational truths, such as caring for others is a good thing, good should be done and evil avoided, dying for a righteous cause is a noble thing, are understood regardless of experience, just as we know that 2 + 2 is 4. In his last scholarly book, called The Discarded Image, Lewis showed that morality is determined by right reason, or the Stoic idea of natural law. Here's Lewis again. The Stoics believed in a natural law in which all rational men, in virtue of their rationality, saw to be binding on them. St. Paul's statement in Romans 2 that there is a law written in the hearts of even of Gentiles who do not know the law is in full conformity with the Stoic conception, and would for centuries be so understood. Nor during those centuries would the word hearts have any mere emotional associations. The Hebrew word which St. Paul represents by cardia would be more nearly translated as mind. Lewis posed similar arguments in his books The Problem of Pain and Christian Reflections. Of central importance in Lewis's discussion of natural law is his critique of moral relativism, found in utilitarianism as a theory of ethics and a guide to behavior, the so-called view, the end justifies the means. Lewis claimed that the precepts of moral ethics cannot be just innovated or improvised as we go along. Picking and choosing among the code of the Tao is inherently foolish and harmful. He noted, for example, that attempts to define moral ethics as the product of a physicalism of survival and instinct create a profound dilemma. On the one hand, the utilitarian, or what Lewis called the innovator, as Lewis referred in his book, The Abolition of Man, tries to make judgments of the value of human choices by claiming that one decision is good or not. But on what basis is this valuation made if the only standard that exists is instinct? Lewis shows that all such valuations necessarily must use the objective standard of the Tao to do so, even if only partially. As he stated, quote, the innovator rates high the claims of posterity. He cannot get any valid claim for posterity out of instinct. He's really deriving our duty to posterity from the Tao. Our duty to do good to all men is an axiom of practical reason, and our duty to do good to our descendants is a clear deduction from it. But then in every form of the Tao, which has come down to us side by side as the duty to children and descendants, lies the duty to parents and ancestors. By what right do we reject one and accept the other? To get people fed and clothed is a great end. And in the pursuit of it, scruples about justice and good faith may be set aside, allegedly. But the Tao, of course, agrees that the importance of getting people fed and clothed. Unless the innovator were himself using the Tao, he could never learn of such a duty of justice and good faith, which he is ready to debunk. He may be a jingoist, a racialist, an extreme nationalist who maintains the advancement of his own people is the object to which all else ought to yield, but no kind of factual observation and no appeal to instinct will give him a ground for his opinion. Once more, he is in fact deriving it from the Tao, as Lewis had stated. Lewis hence described the natural law as a cohesive and interconnected objective standard of right behavior. Quote, this thing which I've called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law, or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole system of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all values are rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new standard of value in its place is self-contradictory. There has never been and will never be a radically different judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems, or as they're called, ideologies, consist in reality of fragments of the Tao itself, unquote. Now, as a proponent of natural law, Lewis was a supporter of what some call the law of equal liberty. But he was a firm critic of imposed egalitarianism for any reason. He further understood that egalitarianism is too often a cloak for envy, the sin of coveting, and that such appeals for regimentation are tyrannical. Here's Lewis again. The demand for equality has two sources. One of them is among the noblest. The other is the basis of human emotions. The noble source is the desire for fair play, but the other source is the hatred of superiority. Equality outside of mathematics is a purely social conception. It applies to man as a political and economic animal. It has no place in the world of the mind. Beauty is not democratic. She reveals herself more to the few than to the many, more to the persistent and disciplined seekers than to the many, more to the persistent and disciplined seekers than to the careless. Virtue is not democratic. She is achieved by those who pursue her more hotly than most men. Truth is not democratic. She demands special talents and special industry in those to whom she gives her favors. Political democracy is doomed if it tries to extend its demand for equality into these highly spheres, ethical, intellectual, or aesthetic democracy is death, unquote. Lewis also recognized that innate individual human differentiation and how each individual soul's uniqueness is divinely ordained. Quote, "It is idle to say that men are of equal value. If value is taken in a worldly sense, if we mean that all men are equally useful, or beautiful, or good, or entertaining, this is nonsense," unquote. Lewis also rejected the determinism of both genetic and environmental causality for mankind. In the so-called modernist perspective, man is not viewed as a moral agent, but as an entity that is conditioned solely by non-rational causes. And all that counts is not what is just, but the utilitarian what works. If man has free will and is considered accountable for his actions, there are limits on the state's power. But if individuals act out of necessity, they're not moral agents. In the place of punishment for wrongdoing, preemption becomes the means of social control. As championed by authoritarians of both left and right, the state simply eliminates the individual's choice, or more exactly, makes the choice for him or her. And this elimination is the basis for the progressive precautionary principle and govern measures of prior restraint based on it. Lewis discussed this problem at length in his book, The Abolition of Man, that I mentioned earlier, as well as in various essays, including The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment, found in his book, God in the Dock. Lewis consequently drew a clear distinction between the reality of the importance for individual liberty and the tendencies to fall prey to the absurdities and dangers of collectivism. He states that, quote, "The first of these tendencies is the growing exaltation of the collective and the growing indifference to persons. If one were inventing a language for sinless beings who love their neighbors as themselves, it would be appropriate to have no words for my, I, and other personal pronouns and inflections. In other words, no difference between two opposite solutions of the problem of selfishness, between love, which is the relation between persons, and the abolition of persons. Nothing but a thou can love, and a thou can only exist for an I. A society in which no one was conscious of himself as a person over and against other persons, where none could say, I love you, would indeed be free from selfishness, but not through love. It would be unselfish as a bucket of water is unselfish. In such case, the individual does not matter. And therefore, when we really get going, it will not matter what you do to an individual. Lewis continues, secondly, we have the emergence of the party in the modern sense, the fascists, Nazis, or communists. What distinguishes this from the political parties of the 19th century is the belief of its members that they are not really trying to carry out a program, but are obeying an important force, that nature, or evolution, or the dialectic, or the race is carrying them on. This tends to be accompanied by two beliefs. The belief that the process which the party embodies is inevitable, and the belief that the forwarding of this process is a supreme duty and abrogates all ordinary moral laws, i.e. the Tao. In the state of mind, men can become devil worshippers in the sense that they can now honor as well as obey their own vices. All men at times obey their vices, but it is when cruelty, envy, and lust of power appear as the commands of a great superpersonal force that they can be exercised with so-called self-approval, unquote. Lewis understood that without this necessary natural law framing of social, legal, and political culture, mankind would no longer be recognized as worthy of rights or even common decency, but instead would be left defenseless to any and all forms of oppression. Here is Lewis again, quote, "For if I am not deceived, we are all at this moment helping to decide whether humanity shall retain all that has hitherto made humanity worth preserving, or whether we must slide down into the subhumanity imagined by Aldous Huxley and George Orwell and realized in part in Hitler's Germany," unquote. We hence have the basis for the scientific brave new world in which the citizen and government become slave and master. Exactly what Lewis critiqued in his essay, Is Progress Possible? Willing Slaves of the Welfare State. In his book, God and the Dock, which I mentioned again, what all this means is the elimination of what makes mankind human in the first place. As Lewis explained the problem, quote, the question has become whether we can discover any way of submitting to the worldwide paternalism of a technocracy without losing all personal privacy and independence. Is there any possibility of getting the super welfare state's honey and avoiding the sting? Let us make no mistake about the sting. To live his life in his own way, to call his house his castle, to enjoy the fruits of his own labor, to educate his children as his conscience directs, to save for their prosperity after his death. These are wishes deeply ingrained in civilized man. As the form of government most concerned with his study of natural law and the nature of man, Lewis settled on democracy, not majoritarianism, but self-government, as in Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, considering it the least bad political structure. It should be established only in order to limit centralized political power. Here is Lewis, quote, I'm a Democrat because I believe man is free to choose good or evil, though most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. A great deal of democratic enthusiasm descends from the ideas of people like Rousseau, who believed in democracy because they thought mankind so wise and good that everyone deserved a share in the government. The danger of defending democracy on those grounds is that they're not true. I find that they're not true without looking further than myself. I don't deserve a share in governing a henhouse, much less a nation, nor do most people. Man is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. But I reject slavery because I see no man fit to be masters. Now, in his book, The Weight of Glory, Lewis similarly notes the need for radically constrain the powers of government, paraphrasing Lord Acton's axiom on the corrupting influence of power. Quote, I do not believe that God created an egalitarian world. Since we have sin, we have found, as Lord Acton says, that all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Theocracy has been rightly abolished, not because it is bad that priests should govern ignorant laymen, but because priests are wicked men like the rest of us. But Lewis fully understood that democracy, if unchecked, becomes egalitarianism and will trample on liberty as a collectivist force for evil by celebrating pride and envy as it fosters tyranny. Lewis' demonic Screwtape, this time in his essay, Screwtape proposes a toast, once again explains eloquently how this very thing has happened historically, even in the supposed pursuit of liberty. This is Screwtape. Hidden in the heart of this striving for liberty, there was also a deep hatred of personal freedom. That invaluable man Rousseau first revealed it. In his perfect democracy, only the state religion is permitted. Again, this is Screwtape speaking, and everything that Screwtape says is inverted from the truth. Slavery is restored, and the individual is told that he has really willed, if he didn't know it, whatever the government tells him to do. From that starting point via Hegel, another indispensable propagandist on our side, we easily contrived both the Nazi and the communist state. Even in England, we were pretty successful. I heard the other day that in that country, a man could not, without a permit, cut down his own tree with his own axe, make it into planks with his own saw, and use the planks to build a tool shed in his own garden. At the root of the developing tyranny are the things many people may least expect: democracy and egalitarianism. Here's Lewis again. Democracy is the word with which you must lead them by the nose, and of course it is connected with the political ideal that men should be equally treated. You then make a stealthily transition in their minds from this political ideal to a factual belief that all men are equal, especially the man you are working on. As a result, you can use the word democracy to sanction in his thought the most degrading and also the least enjoyable of human feelings. You can get him to practice, not only without shame, but with a positive glow of self-approval, conduct that he would universally be derided. Dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to intelligent and industrious pupils. That would be undemocratic. And anyway, the teachers, or should I say nurses, will be far too busy reassuring the dunces and patting them on the back to waste any time on real teaching. This would not follow unless all education became state education. Penal taxes designed for that purpose are liquidating the middle class, a class who were prepared to save and spend and make sacrifices in order to have their children privately educated. Above all, Lewis was a keen observer of the world he lived in. He consistently recognized the implications of every development in the galloping socialism of post-World War II England. Quote, "The political philosophy implicit in most modern communities has stolen us unawares. 2 wars have created vast curtailments of liberty, and we have grown, though grudgingly, accustomed to our chains. Our intellectuals have surrendered first to the slave philosophy of Hegel, then Marx, finally to the linguistic analysts. The modern state exists not to protect our rights, but to do us good, or make us good anyway, to do something to us, or to make us something. Hence the name leaders for those who were once rulers. We are less their subjects than their wards, pupils, or domestic animals. There's nothing left of which we can say to them, mind your own business. In response, for them, our lives are their business." In contrast to the moral relativism, utilitarianism, collectivism, and authoritarianism of the progressives, the profound lessons from Lewis' extensive writings pertaining to liberty are absolutely clear. If it's in man's power to treat himself as a mere natural object and his judgments of value as raw material for scientific manipulation to alter at will, the real objection is that if man chooses to treat himself as raw material he will be. Not raw material to be manipulated as he fondly imagined by himself, but by mere appetite, that is mere nature, in the person of his dehumanized conditioners. Either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or natural law, or else we're mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motivated but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and rule alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary for the very idea of a rule of law which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. The process which, if not checked, will abolish man on a pace among communists and Democrats, no less among fascists. The methods may at first differ in brutality, but many a mild-eyed scientist, many a popular dramatist, many an amateur philosopher in our midst means in the long run just the same as the Nazi rulers of Germany. In Lewis's most famous book series, The Chronicles of Narnia, the land of Narnia is held in place by the sacred deep magic or natural law, or what Lewis called the Tao. And to transgress this moral code is to do evil, as the White Witch and others did. Toward the end of the first book in the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was made into the highly successful 2005 film, the children Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy assumed their rightful thrones as kings and queens of Narnia. Lewis described how they governed during this golden age of Narnia and their most important accomplishments. Quote, "And they made good laws and kept the peace, and liberated young dwarves and young satyrs from being sent to government schools, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live." Thank you.
Well, that was quite good there, David, I have to say. You know, it's interesting when you're commenting there about the realities of how it's seeming like this perpetual fight between freedom and slavery, so to speak. The appeal of the freedom side sounds so great. Why is there this continual resurgence to circle back around to the idea of some form of collectivism or others controlling others?
Well, I think Lewis would say, and many other philosophers would say, and I think most of the history of world literature reflect the point, that man is given, mankind, man and woman, are given the opportunity to make choices between serving themselves without restraint, or recognizing that there is the subjective natural code that they're subject to. And the natural code includes not killing innocent people, not stealing, defrauding, raping, etc., practicing the golden rule, and so on and so forth. And Lewis, at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, there's an appendix in which he goes through ancient documents from different civilizations, such as China, Babylon, Greece, Egypt, and he finds and shows that there's a surprising similarity to the coding of what is considered to be ethical behavior in all these civilizations. Not to say that the rulers complied with it, they definitely did not. But the folk did, by and large, otherwise the civilization couldn't exist. So mankind is given the option with free will to choose between good and evil, and the tendency, the default is to choose oneself over this standard, to get what you can get away with. And every tyranny is based on that. So what Lewis is basically pointing out is with the rise up of the West based on this melding of the Judeo-Christian tradition with the Greco-Roman tradition of natural law is why the West arose, and the ideas of liberty and the rule of law and science and enterprise and free markets came into existence. But mankind still has this fundamental nature. Now, if man didn't have this nature of self-serving and to be duplicitous, you might say, the idea of the natural law would be unimportant. But the fact that natural law is there and it's the way Lewis described it is that you can't get it out of your head. There's this nagging sense that something should be done and something should not be done. It's not to say that unpacking the natural law, we can get everything right, because we're mortal and we have limits in what we can know and so forth, but he does show that over time we have become more attuned to what this means, and the rise of the principles, Aquinas was probably the first to really set forth natural law in a sophisticated way. Incidentally, Acton described Aquinas as the first Whig or first liberal. But the whole tradition of Montesquieu and Locke and Tocqueville and Madison and Jefferson and modern writers like Mises and Hayek and others are part of that whole tradition.
Very good. David, I see you have your hand up. I have you unmuted.
Thank you, Jeff. I've got myself unmuted now. David, this is David Brant Demers with Roads to Freedom Foundation.
Yes.
From your description, C.S. Lewis essentially sounds like a voluntarist based on his positions on competitive governance and bottom-up leadership by example, as opposed to authoritarianism. What are your thoughts on Lewis's positions on free markets and the private sector in relation to man's moral foundation and well-being of human society?
Lewis, I think, would be described as a Christian natural law classical liberal. His view of government was the smaller the better. And so he was a critic of government schools. He was a critic of, I mean, you name it. But his view was, as I mentioned earlier, that he didn't really care to follow politics or partisanship. He was more concerned about the ethical culture of the society itself. And Tolkien, his best friend, shared this great concern. And the reason why they wrote, in Lewis's case, the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy and other fiction, and in Tolkien's case, Lord of the Rings and so forth, was because they were concerned that modern man didn't have sort of grand epic myths that upheld these values. And they wanted to write those books, which they wanted to read, and they felt were missing. And so that's why they did that. By the way, one sort of interesting anecdote is that this literary society that they created, called the Inklings, existed during the same time as another literary society called the Bloomsbury Group. And the Bloomsbury Group included Virginia
Woolf.
Virginia Woolf and her husband, Evelyn Waugh, when he was, before he became a Christian, and many others. And the Bloomsbury Group were the toast of British society as far as reviews of their books and literary status and so on and so forth, because they fit this modernist view. There's no God, there's no truth. It's sort of a nihilistic, moral relativistic, epistemologically void viewpoint. But if you look at the influence of the Inklings compared to the Bloomsbury Group, there's no comparison. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has sold something like 150 million sets of the 3 volumes. The Chronicles of Narnia have sold almost exactly the same for the 7 volumes. So I think what Lewis and Tolkien were saying was correct, that there is a hunger for this perspective. I think one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson is such a big deal and a world phenomenon is because he's also tapping into that same enduring point. Lewis and Tolkien were very interested in world mythology and so forth. Their field was, both of them was medieval Renaissance literature, but when they were professors, you read everything in literature and anything new that came out. Today you can't do that because it's just so much stuff. A lot of it is not worth reading anyway. But Lewis was profoundly motivated by this. And I think he and Tolkien both had enormous creative talents and were great writers. And so I think that they are important figures to keep in mind. Also, if you simply look at it from a voluntarist position or a classical liberal or libertarian position, if you add every other book by every other historical figure that discussed liberty, as far as the total book sales, Lewis and Tolkien far outweigh all the others combined.
Thank you.
Pretty amazing achievement for sure. Charles, I see you have your hand up as well.
Thank you, Jeff. David, so you mentioned Lord Acton, a Christian libertarian, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, same thing, Christian libertarians. Not all Christians are libertarians, but there's plenty of libertarianism in Christianity from a lot of the sages throughout time. To what extent do you think libertarianism is there with some Christian activism? And when you see Christians that aren't very libertarian but are more statist in their methods to solve what they can perceive as cultural ills or militarism, how do you think a revival of appreciation of the C.S. Lewis works that most Christians are pretty familiar with can help them get a more coherent political worldview to get them on the side of liberty to really get us to the next stage in world society based on liberty?
No, there's no question about it that, and it's not just Christians, it's people of all different kinds of religions, but just focusing on Christians, progressivism as a narrative has dominated the intellectual world for basically after the Enlightenment, and it has accelerated since the end of the 19th century. But it is the elite view. And so the view basically is that moral ethics are true, but we have to get on with life. And so the end justifies the means has been embraced. The utilitarian view has been embraced by many people. In fact, some very fervently. But you can't square it, is the point. You can't square it with this natural law perspective. Either you are or you are not breaking the Tao, as Lewis would say. And there's no equivocation about it. So again, getting back to Lewis and Tolkien writing fiction, Lewis described the purpose of doing that was what he called sneak past the watchful dragons. The watchful dragons were the assumptions of modernism, that government knows best, and all the different cliches that and part of what I mentioned in my discussion. So we do think that where you have an interest in, so you might say the original teachings of Jesus and that whole tradition that I discussed. A great book, by the way, that I also mentioned, I recommend everybody, is Rodney Stark's book, The Victory of Reason, in which he tracks this and the rise of the West. In fact, all of Stark's books are very much worth reading. So I think that it's important. Now, one other thing I should mention that pertains to this is the modern view is that God and religion and faith and whatever are superstitions and are fairy tales. There's no afterlife. We're simply matter in motion, and so on and so forth. But Lewis was dealt with this issue very directly in a book he wrote called Miracles, in the first few chapters, in which he basically shows that a materialist worldview or naturalism or atheism has a self-contradiction in it. And he presents why you end up, and he refutes that view. And other philosophers who become far more prominent in philosophy, like Alvin Plantinga and others, have taken this to a very sophisticated extent. So many of our classical liberal and libertarian friends who are atheists or agnostic, and the mainstream progressive world, which essentially believes that too, don't really realize that they have embraced a metaphysics that is incoherent and necessarily denies the existence of individual agency, reason, free will, objective morality, objective truth, etc. So Lewis was part of a renaissance, you might say, in that, which we think is also relevant to a sort of a disconnect, sort of a schizophrenia among many Christians in not connecting the dots.
Quite interesting. Well, it looks like we have time for one good last question here before we have to wrap it up for the day. And thank you in advance, David, for that. Has anyone got something in mind? I see, Charles, did you have your hand again?
I do, Jeff. Okay, yeah, here's what it was. Lewis's friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, is having his Lord of the Rings prequel, the Second Age, coming to the TV next year in the most expensive production in history.
Right.
Is your C.S. Lewis Society considering exploring that
Sure.
as an opportunity to tell folks what Tolkien was really all about? Because, December 11th, I'll go ahead and preview, we have Paul Cantor on this 4:00 webinar from UVA, and most libertarians into literature know that he and Steve Cox had that great book on teaching political economy based on literature, which is my favorite way to teach political economy, based on a story.
Right.
So here we have the biggest TV production in history coming with Lewis's friend Tolkien.
Right.
How do we exploit this?
Well, there are two things. One is Amazon is behind that, and they are going to do a prequel series to Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote a multi-volume history of Middle-earth, and the Lord of the Rings story is the history of Middle-earth declines as the evil practices of people and tyranny and so forth continue to decline the lives of people. And Lord of the Rings is when it sort of almost hits rock bottom and then it recovers. So there's a huge amount of material that Amazon can draw on. Also, it's worth noting that Netflix is going to be doing a new series of the Chronicles of Narnia, which is going to be a big deal as well. And the reason why these successful film and streaming operations are doing this is because they know it sells. There's a huge following for this. Lewis himself has almost an iconic position across every kind of Christian world, Catholic, all Protestants, Orthodox, Mormons, and he has quite a following among Muslims and Hindus and many others, as well as secular people. So there is a huge opportunity to connect with people. One of the things that the Lewis Society has done is that we've had premieres of films, we've co-sponsored stage productions of Lewis's work, and there are many other opportunities. So it's in the culture, and it's a way to communicate with vast numbers of people that classical liberals have not really, I think, been attuned to connecting with, and these people are looking for answers. People naturally search for meaning and purpose. You could say that we are relational beings. We seek to love and be loved. And Lewis and Tolkien tap into that in a very powerful way.
Very nice. Well, again, I want to thank you for today. That was very, very good. And as usual, we're going to want to encourage everyone to come for the next occasion. It's going to continue with another exciting theme. I'm going to let you do a quick little preview here, Charles, and then we're going to let everyone do.
For sure. And so there's your list of guests coming up over the next month. Todd Meyer from the Washington Policy Center next week on a free market response to all the alarmism on environmental risks and harms. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to explore a little more deeply than Reason did this whole idea of geoengineering to solve our climate woes. And in 3 weeks, we'll have Gorbachev's econ advisor, Yuri Maltsev, talk about the state of desocializing the world. And finally, in a month, we'll return to that great Ron Paul rallying cry to end the Fed with Richard Ebeling from the Future of Freedom Foundation. And then December 11th, I'll go ahead and preview that with Paul Cantor, the UVA Shakespeare professor, who is well known for his books on modern popular culture and classic literature on how to use those stories to teach political economy and liberty, kind of like today's theme. So that's the preview, Jeff.
Had myself muted there for a quick moment. I appreciate that. And as I said, we're going to see everyone in a week. As you can see here again are the links for you to kind of participate. And again, David, that was really, really fantastic. And it's nice to see, that, there's enough strong thoughts out there to try to keep perpetuating the right ideas as we continually fight against the upside of the wrong ideas from the controllers of the world out there. So thanks so much for today. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.